Have you heard of the term elevated horror? If you have seen any of the films like The Menu, The Pearl, The Witch, Lighthouse, Hereditary, Midsommar, those are the films that are commonly associated with the genre. And then there is an ongoing discussion on which film deserves an elevated status and why is it even elevated? Why does horror specifically needs an elevated status? Nobody called Call Me By Your Name an elevated romance, so why does other genres can exist without justifying themselves? In this video I want to talk about elevated horror as a genre, what brings film to an elevated status, if the elevated horror is actually an aesthetic, and is genre actually that or never existed? Let's get into this. Hey everyone, if you're new here, my name is Daria, and on this channel I'm talking about films and culture mostly. And I also have a Substack newsletter where I analyze films and their relation to the current cultural trends. You can find a link down below in a video description and join in to discuss films together. While doing the research for this video, I kind of found the two opinions that people have online and in media on elevated horror. One, people calling it snobbish and elitist to elevate some films to status of worthy. The other side actually believes that the genre doesn't exist and those films are just psychological horror or thrillers. I actually think elevated horror is a subgenre with a very specific aesthetic, or elevated horror is just an aesthetic of film. To explain what I mean, let's look at the several films that have defined elevated horror as a genre. The Witch, released in 2015, directed by Robert Eggers, is arguably the first film associated with elevated horror. It's a folklore-inspired story set in puritanical New England in the 1630s. It has period-accurate language and historical details which made it stand out from other horror films of the time. The plot of the film revolves around the family, which is cast out of their plantation for their radical religious views and lives in a remote house close to the woods, haunted by the witch. At the time of the release, not only film became the biggest financial success of A24, it also has established the aesthetics which studio continued using in their future horror films. For example, in the narrative, The Witch has a classic horror supernatural element, the witch, but it mainly focuses on psychological state of the characters, isolation, paranoia, and increasing tension between the family members. But unlike the classic horror, which builds tension and releases it immediately in a jump scare or a death of the character, the pace in The Witch is slow, with tension increasing throughout the film until its release in the final film, which has a lot of violence. Furthermore, film has a lot of visually distinctive aesthetics, like opening scene has symmetrically framed shots, a lot of central camera framing, and tracking shots. These are stylistic choices that Eggers makes deliberately to put the focus on internal conflicts of the family in their psychological state, instead of focusing on the external threat like a witch. And then we see other A24 films using similar aesthetics. For example, Hereditary, another big elevated horror film released in 2018, directed by Ari Aster, focuses on domestic drama with a supernatural angle, combining narrative about grief and demonic possessions. Even though the film has some jump scares to startle the audience and the sound design accompanying it, we see the same elevated horror elements. Slow-paced camera movement, objects centered within the frame, slower developing film with a fast-paced climax and monstrous threat at the end. Narrative builds up tension, relying on psychological drama, as Ari Aster explores themes of the generational trauma in film. And then Midsommar, released in 2019, another Ari Aster film, follows similar stylistic choices. Centered composition and slow camera movements, a lot of symmetrical shots, especially in the remote village of, sorry if I pronounce it wrong, Harga, and once again the narrative focuses on psychological state of main character. Film has a slasher movie narrative as the characters are killed off one by one throughout the film, but the main difference is the deaths are not shown on screen, which adds to reserved elevated horror feel. We can see if elevated horror to be defined, it is an aesthetics, as all of those films have very similar stylistic and directorial choices. Coming back to the original question, if elevated horror is really an aesthetics, why does the genre exist at all? As I previously mentioned, this genre has gathered a lot of criticism for being elitist and snobbish, as the name implies that some horror films are better than others. However, there is generally understood criteria of what makes a movie a good movie, and isn't it a job of the audience to decide in the first place whether the film meets that criteria or not? In the article, a dissection of term elevated horror, author writes, therefore, the issue here is not inherently tied to the idea of subcategorization itself. Subgenres like the slasher, found footage, and supernatural horror are all incredibly helpful distinctions when sorting through the genre. Rather, the problem is that elevating only some horror movies is a pretentious way to suggest that these select films are so good that they cannot be associated with the rest of their genre. This is problematic for a few reasons. Firstly, elevated horror, and the genre as it's known today, is a product of its predecessors. Good and bad, the horror genre is at the point it is today because of the films that paved the way, challenged ideas, and became examples of what not to do. Secondly, this implies the only way horror can be respected is to completely dissociate from its genre, and then can it achieve respect. Thirdly, in reality, elevated horror has always been around. And I think, unfortunately, separation of art into lowbrow and highbrow is unlikely to disappear anytime soon. Like in case with horror, it exists, even though being classist, to appeal to audience that otherwise maybe wouldn't have watched those films or would consider them unworthy of their time. In the article, The Billion-Dollar Underdog, A24 and the Business of Cultural Capital, author writes, slow burn horror about a Puritan family unraveling in a New England woods, the which features no jump scares and no stars. Shot in candlelight and written performed in 17th century English, it should have been a hard sell. Yet A24 backed it, branded it, and sold it as a must-have object of taste. It gave the first-time filmmaker creative freedom to make an eerie, theologically dense period piece, and it turned it into a commercial and critical hit. It seems like there is direct correlation between the box office success of the film and of its elevated title, as mostly only successful financially films have been given the title. For example, The Substance, released in 2024, is a grotesque body horror, initially seemed to be destined for cult-level classic, but the moment it started getting prestigious nominations, it appeared on the elevated horror lists. And that tracks when you think that all of the films associated with the genre, like Jordan Peele's Get Out or Ari Aster's Midsommar, both were award-winning and box office successes. And that's exactly what A24 did so well. They used this aesthetics as a marketing tool to promote and sell their other films that would appeal to both mainstream audience and to cinephiles. And that tactic worked. And you might say, so what, Daria? And they use it like a marketing tool to deliver good films, and there's good directors that came out of this. So how's the problem? And I say, you might be right. Because after all, A24 is not solely responsible for this genre and type of film aligning with audiences' interests and preferences at a certain time. In fact, anything really in art, literature, music has cycles. Usually audiences are tired of certain film genre, then something new comes to screens, like a new kid on the block. People like it and want more of it, and everyone starts doing the same film, and then it's becoming somewhat a mainstream, and a lot of people start following it until it becomes saturated again, and people want, again, something new. Before elevated horror in the 2000s, there was a lot of gore horror and torture horror, like Saw or Hostel. But in the 2010s, people just got tired of it, and the slower pace movies with a psychological element of horror instead of crazy guy with a saw or imaginative monster in the woods was more scary. And at the same time, it is also true that psychological horror is nothing new. Dario Argento was building slow burn, atmosphere-driven psychological horror in the 1970s, with one of my personal favorites, Suspiria, is the best example of it. Hitchcock is known to have been obsessed with the psychological thrillers and the suspense building. He was in fact the first one to show the reaction of the character that is being threatened instead of what is threatening them to create tension. And in the 80s, I would argue that Shining would have been categorized as elevated horror.
Here's Johnny.
Possession by Andrzej Żuławski, another favorite of mine, is also known for its psychological horror elements, and it's a film that still inspires a lot of directors today. Gary Barker named it his inspiration for Obsession. When asked about the term elevated horror, Ari Aster, director of Hereditary and Midsommar, said, "It is a shame that the genre has such a bad reputation among the elite to the point where you need to distinguish whether a film is a celebration of the genre or an elevation of the genre." The term might get cancelled for being elitist or pretentious, and in my opinion, maybe rightfully so. But the genre cycles are usually just a reflection of the time they appear in. The elevated horror, with its slow pacing, symmetrical shots, psychologically drama-centered narrative, is no exception. It came as a direct response to gore and slasher films of the 2000s from audience that wanted to see something different. Get Out did not become box office success because it was psychological horror, but because it explored themes of systematic racism, cultural appropriation, and commodification of Black people. The Witch did not become a success because of the centered shots and the slow-paced camera, but because it explored the themes of religion, puritanical repression, patriarchy, female autonomy, and religious extremism. Horror as a genre always talked about topics that other genres have avoided, and hopefully in the future it will get more credit for it.
Thank you.